Well, Mugabe leaves behind a country burdened by years of economic crisis. Once known as the breadbasket of southern Africa, Mugabe's move to seize white-owned farms in the 1990s hit food production and exports severely. And this led to soaring unemployment and hyperinflation in 2008, which hit levels so high that Zimbabwe had to abandon its currency a year later. Under new president Emmerson Mnangagwa, things haven't changed much. The country is facing its worst economic crisis in a decade, forcing millions of citizens to flee the country. Well, let's look deeper now into Mugabe's economic legacy with Lloyd Msipa. He's a corporate lawyer, investment advisor, and commentator on African politics, and he joins us now live from London. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's start with a look at the overall economic legacy of Mugabe's term as president. Talk about some of the policies that he really used to shape the country.
Well, as you know, after 1980, after a brutal war in the bush, Mugabe actually introduced the first policy was reconciliation, where he simply said to his enemies, look, let's turn our swords into plowshares. And what they did is that he formed a new government, brought in former ministers from the Smith regime, whom he had been fighting. So that was a flagship policy, which was reconciliation, because he was bent on creating a rainbow nation. After that, he embarked on an education policy exercise in which has seen 90% of Zimbabweans very, very literate, such that they're marketable all over the world. So he was a man of his word, that in the first 10 years of independence, we had bridges built, we had new schools built, and he went on to even include, amend the constitution to include things like gender parity. So even in today's Zimbabwe, you will find that women are equal to men. If you look in public enterprises, you find that the leader might be a man, but the deputy is a woman. For instance, if you look at the judiciary, for instance, you got the Chief Justice male and is deputized by a woman. So gender parity is one of the policies and legacies that he brought onto shape Zimbabwe.
Now, Lloyd, I do also want to get to some of his later accomplishments, because we know that some people have some quite mixed feelings about how he started his legacy versus how he finished it. Talk about some of the legacies later on in his term and some of the criticisms that was also found.
We need to understand that Robert Mugabe was not a saint. He was a human being like you and me. And so he had his mistake. He made his mistakes. And when he was making those mistakes, we need to understand that it was not simply him making the mistakes. He was now interacting with the global village, after acting up on things like the land redistribution exercise. Go back to Lancaster, there was an undertaking by the British government and other players that they will fund the land redistribution exercise. And when that didn't happen, what he did, he went on a land grab without compensation, which obviously in 2003 resulted in the sanctions being imposed on the country. That on its own, changed the trajectory which Zimbabwe was going. So in that case, you had a situation where, in an attempt to break the sanctions, he would ask institutions like the Reserve Bank to do more than what they were mandated to do. Parastatals were given a mandate to find a way of surviving those sanctions. So in that environment, we had corruption beginning to fester. And so as Zimbabwe took a different turn and the trajectory changed with all those, in that new environment.
Now, Lloyd, we know that Zimbabwe is still struggling even after the ouster of Robert Mugabe. Why do you think it's taking so long to really change the underlying social, political, and economic image of the country?
Well, when President Emmerson Mnangagwa took over, what simply happened was we had a new face. The key institutions remained in place, from the judiciary, the civil service, and of course the sanctions still remain intact, and Americans are bent on renewing them every year. So nothing has changed in that regard. Since they will say to themselves, what resources that we're going to try and leverage and in time bring Zimbabwe to to where it's supposed to be. It's not an easy task. We've had years of corruption, years of being undermined by elements, European Union and America. So it's a fight that the Zimbabweans are fighting, and it's not easy, and it's going to go on until final victory. I mean, Ian Smith, excuse me, for instance, had sanctions on him by the United Nations, but these are not United Nations sanctions.
Right.
These are sanctions imposed by individual countries, and they tend to be more, debilitating than UN sanctions, which are based on rules and international law.
Certainly important to remember. Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Lloyd Msipa, corporate lawyer, investment advisor, and commentator on African politics.